Guys, I'm currently in Rugeley at the Old Chancel and wait until you see how much disease that place is harbouring. Honest to God, I took one look in there and I feel like I've got bloody bird flu now. Anyway, enough of me, more of the video, let's get into it.
Across the road from St Augustine's church in Rugeley, there's a ruin that's easy to pass without fully understanding what it is. You can see the old tower, the surviving stonework, and the churchyard around it. But unless you already know the story, the place does not really explain itself. Most people know it as the Old Chancel, but that name only tells you what survived. It doesn't tell you what this place once was. This was Rugeley's old parish church. Before the present St Augustine's was built across the road, this was where generations of local people came for the important moments of life. They came here for worship, to be baptised, to get married and to get buried. So when you stand here now, you're not just looking at old stone left behind. You're standing in one of the key sites of Rugeley's parish history. The building's easy to underestimate because it no longer looks like a complete church. The tower still survives, and so does the chancel, along with the north chapel. There's also remains that show how the older church was once laid out. Even in this broken form, there's enough left to understand how important this place once was to the town. The story of the site goes back to at least the 12th century. By 1189, there was definitely a church here at Rugeley. And we know that because King Richard I granted Rugeley and Cannock, along with the churches, to the canons of Lichfield. That means this church was already important enough to appear in official records. And it was tied directly to the religious power of Lichfield Cathedral. Some local accounts suggest the building may have started even earlier, possibly around 1150, with links to the Depoys family. I probably need a little bit more evidence to state that as gospel. But even if we only go with the later firm record of 1189, this still takes the church back to the earliest written history we have for Rugeley's parish church. At that time, Rugeley would have been a much smaller place than it is today. The church wouldn't have been somewhere people just went on a Sunday. It would have been one of the main places where the life of the community was marked. The chancel's the part that gives this site the name. In a medieval church, the chancel was the sacred eastern end of the building. It was where the altar stood, and it was the part most closely connected with the priest and the service itself. That's why the name Old Chancel has stuck. The name don't describe the whole church as it once stood. It describes the part that survived strongly enough for local memory to hold on to it. One newspaper describes a visit by the North Staffordshire Naturalist Field Club. They came by train from Stoke and arrived at Rugeley at noon. They walked to the old church from the station, and at the churchyard gate they were met by Reverend Greer, who took them around the site with a leader, Mr. Lynham. They came by train from Stoke, arrived at Rugeley at noon, and walked to the old church from the station. At the churchyard gate, they were met by the Reverend Mr. Greer, who took them around the site. The leader was Mr. Lynham, and he seemed to have treated the building with real care. He wasn't just looking at it as a ruin, he was trying to read the history of the church through the stonework. Lynham pointed out the south wall of the chancel as one of the oldest looking parts of the building. He noticed the strength of the wall, the single lancet window, and the priest's doorway on the south side. That priest's doorway matters because it shows how the building was actually used. It wasn't just there to make the church look good. It gave the priest a way into the chancel. It reminds us that this ruin was once a working church, with people moving in and out as part of parish life. When the church was complete, it would have looked completely different from what we see now. The tower stood at the west end, and the chancel stood at the east end. Between them both was the main body of the church where the people of Rugeley would have gathered. There was also a north aisle and a north chapel. The chapel became connected with important local families, especially the Westons, who held land around Hagley, Rugeley and Brereton, but more on them soon. The Westons had memorials inside the old church. One of them was John Weston, whose brass was dated 1566. There were also later Weston monuments from the early 1600s. The Lander family were remembered here too. Thomas Lander, who died in 1670, had a large monument with coats of arms. That tells you something about how churches like this worked. There were places of worship, but there were also places where important local families wanted to be remembered. To have your name recorded inside the church mattered. It meant your family had a permanent place in the memory of the parish. The old church also had bells with a story of their own. 6 bells were cast in the early 1700s by the Rugeley family of Gloucester. When the new St Augustine's was built across the road, those bells were moved into the new church. That's a nice little detail because it means the old church did not completely fall silent. Even after most of the older building was abandoned, part of its sound carried on across the road. The place changed, but the voice of the old church continued in the new one. Long before the old church was replaced, there were serious problems with the building. A survey was carried out on the 19th of April 1765, and it does not describe a church that was simply a bit tired. It describes a building that was already in a real trouble. The north wall was badly damaged, and the south wall was leaning dangerously. The roof timbers were weak, and the gutters were in poor condition, with the pressure from the roof pushing the walls outwards. That matters because it comes through in some of the latest stories. People sometimes said the old church had been ruined by Cromwell's soldiers. Others said it had been burnt or that the building had simply fallen down. But I think the evidence points to something more ordinary. The church was old and it was weak, it needed serious repair, and repairing it properly would have cost money. By the early 1800s, there was another problem as well. The church was too small for the parish, so Rugeley had a choice. It could spend money repairing an old church that would no longer properly serve the town, or it could build a new one across the road. In the end, the parish chose the new church. Viscount Anson gave land for it, and the present St Augustine's was consecrated in 1823. The cost was recorded very precisely. It came to £6,501, 17 shillings and 2¼ pence. That money came from several places. People gave voluntary subscriptions. Some of the money came from selling pews. There was also a gift from the Church Building Society. Part of the cost was met by selling material taken from the old church. That last point's important because the old church did not simply stand there while the new one replaced it. Parts of it were taken away and sold to help pay for the new building, so in a strange way, the medieval church helped fund its own replacement. After the new church was built, much of the old one was removed. The nave disappeared and so did the aisles, along with the porch and other parts of the building. However, what remained was the tower, the chancel, the north chapel and some of the arches that once connected the building together. That's why the old chancel feels so unusual today. You're not looking at a complete church, you're looking at the pieces Rugeley chose not to destroy. And the missing parts matter just as much as the surviving ones. Where the main body of the church once stood, there's now open ground. Where the congregation once gathered, people are now walking through the churchyard. The space is quiet, but it was once one of the busiest parts of the church. The churchyard has its own story. One of the oldest surviving features is the old cross. Some sources describe it as a preaching cross. A 1970 newspaper report calls it the Weeping Cross. Before the Reformation, a cross like this would have meant far more than a decorative feature. It stood as part of the religious life of the churchyard. People would have knelt there to pray, and the worn dip in the stone still shows where knees have pressed into it over time. It stood among the graves as a public sign of faith and remembrance. By the 20th century, even the cross had to be rediscovered. A 1966 article said the remains of an ancient preaching cross had been recently uncovered by boys from the adjoining grammar school. Now that's a mad little detail because it puts the local children into the story of the site. This was not some remote ruin only being studied by experts. It was part of everyday Rugeley and it stood beside a school. It was known by local children and it lived in local memory. By the 1960s, people were worried about the Old Chancel. A newspaper article from 1966 was told the Old Chancel is part of the charm of Rugeley. The writer remembered hearing stories as a child about how the old church had become ruined. Some people said Cromwell's soldiers had damaged it, and some said fire had destroyed it. Some even said the place had simply fallen down, but the writer rejected those stories. The real explanation was far more practical. The old church had just become unsafe and had become too small for the parish. The same article gives us something more personal as well. It says the chancel had once been turned into a miniature chapel, with a wall built across its west end. The same article from '66 gives us something more personal as well. It says the chancel had once been turned into a miniature chapel, with a wall built across its west end. Inside there was an altar and services had still been held there until fairly recently. The writer had even been baptised there. That detail changes the feeling of the ruin. For us it may look like a medieval survival. But for some people in Rugeley, this place was part of their own life story. It was not just something from the distant past, it was somewhere they had actually been taken as a child. The article also says the chancel had once been open for people to walk into. However, later, because of vandalism, it had to be locked. If someone wanted to go inside, they could just collect the key from the vicarage. That says a lot about the relationship between a town and an old building. A place can belong to people for centuries, but once it starts being damaged, access changes. The 1966 article also talks about ghost stories, but not in the way that you might expect. The writer said people often asked whether there was a ghost connected to the Old Chancel. As far as they knew, there was no proper ghost story attached to it. The only story they remembered was from childhood. Themselves and some friends had been walking back from Rugeley Cemetery at dusk, when they saw a grieving woman dressed in black by the churchyard. For a moment they frightened themselves and thought they'd seen something ghostly. Then they realised she was simply a real woman in mourning. That's much stronger than inventing a haunting. It shows how atmosphere works. An old churchyard at dusk can do that, and so can a childhood imagination. And then add on top a woman dressed in black leaving a cemetery. Nah, mate. The 1966 article ended with concern. The writer said the Old Chancel had been neglected in recent years, and there was a danger that Rugeley might one day lose it. They didn't seem to want the place turned into a public park, but they did want something done. The question they asked was simple: what would Rugeley be like without its Old Chancel? A few years later, in 1970, we see the next stage of the story. Another newspaper report said schoolchildren might help lay out the garden of rest around the Old Chancel burial ground. The vicar of Rugeley, Reverend Norman Torrington, had agreed to ask senior children whether they would help document the existing headstones. That detail matters because it shows people knew the ground was about to change. Before the work happened, there was at least an attempt to record what was already there. The scheme was expected to cost more than 5 bags of sand. The plan was to re-level and seed the ground. The report said the headstones were to be used as paving around the Old Chancel and elsewhere. Now that's a difficult detail because on one hand the plan was meant to improve the old burial ground and make it easier to maintain, yet on the other hand using old headstones as paving changes the meaning completely. These stones once marked individual graves. Once they were moved and laid flat into paths, they became part of the landscape instead. That don't mean people didn't care, as I'm sure it was done with good intentions. But it does mean the churchyard was changed forever. The 1970 report also said the vicar wanted a feature to be made of the Weeping Cross. That shows that even while the old burial ground was still being reshaped, parts of its older history were still being recognised. The scheme also needed approval from the Lichfield diocese. So this weren't just a bit of gardening, it was a formal alteration to the old burial ground. The Old Chancel has a long story after the medieval period as well. It was not simply abandoned once the new church was built across the road. People still used it, wrote about it and worried about it. Even protected it and later changed the ground around it. And then strangely in the 1970s it even found its way into the world of Elvis Presley. A 1974 newspaper article reported that Elvis Presley had made stars of 2 local people. They were Margaret Alcock from Colwich and Jonathan Blundell, who was described as the son of a Rugeley policeman. They'd been filmed by the BBC and appeared on Top of the Pops in connection with Elvis Presley's song My Boy. Now obviously Elvis himself didn't come to Rugeley. The BBC made a film insert for the song, and the report said the filming came about after a chance meeting in a Wolverhampton club. A BBC camera crew were looking for a Rugeley garden, and permission was given to use the garden of Don Downs, a local butcher from Wolseley Road. The article says Margaret appeared in the film as Jonathan's mother. The song was about a father's heartbreak at leaving his son after separation. So the BBC needed actors for the story they were filming, and when you watch the surviving footage, the Old Chancel's clearly visible. So Rugeley's medieval church ruin ended up in the background of a 1970s Elvis Presley's television clip. The song got to number 20 in the chart, so I certainly wouldn't say it put Rugeley on the map. And that Elvis Presley connection should not take over the older story of the site, but it does show how places like this can take on new meanings over time. The Old Chancel was not just something left behind from the Middle Ages. It stayed in local memory and appeared in newspapers, became part of preservation debates, and even ended up in a piece of 1970s television. The site began as Rugeley's parish church, with origins going back to at least the 12th century. Over time, the building changed as new parts were added, including the North Chapel and the Tower. It became the place where people worshipped and where families wanted to be remembered, where the life of the parish was marked for hundreds of years. That's the real story of the Old Chancel. It's not just one layer of history sitting on its own. It's a place where medieval Rugeley is still visible, where the decay of the old church can be traced, where Victorian visitors came to study the ruin, and where later generations tried to decide how it should be remembered and looked after. The tower shows what was kept. The chancel shows where the sacred art of the church once stood. The open ground shows where the congregation once gathered. The paving hints at the headstones that were once removed. The old cross reminds you of the churchyard before the Reformation. And across the road, the new St Augustine's carries the parish story that once belonged here. That's the strength of the Old Chancel. It doesn't look complete, and it doesn't give you the whole story at once. But if you stay with it, the place begins to open up. You start with a ruin beside the road, and you end up with nearly 9 centuries of Rugeley's history. And that's why this place matters, not because it's perfect, but because it survived. The Old Chancel is one of those places where Rugeley's past is not hidden in a book, or locked away in an archive. It's still there in the stone, in the ground, and in the stories people kept telling us about. It's still there in the stone, in the ground, and in the stories people kept telling about it.